Have you ever wondered how we know what life was like thousands of years ago? I mean, with no cameras, no diaries, it feels almost impossible, right? But historians, they're kind of like detectives. They follow these ancient clues to piece together the story of a lost world. And today, we're going to join that investigation.
So let's just dive right in. We are traveling back 3,500 years. How on earth do we get inside the heads of people from that long ago? What did they care about? How did they live their lives? Well, it turns out they left behind two very different but super powerful types of clues for us to follow.
On one side of our investigation, we have their words, these ancient voices that were captured in prayers and hymns and passed down for centuries. And on the other side, we have the silent objects they left behind, stones and artifacts from burials that, they tell their own vivid story about life and death and what truly mattered to these people. Okay, let's start with our first clue, the book. We're about to crack open one of the oldest sacred texts in the entire world to get a direct peek into the ancient mind. This book is the Rig Veda, and its story starts about 3,500 years ago. Now, to put that into perspective, this was centuries before the first Olympics, way before Rome was even founded. And here's the really wild part. For hundreds of years, it wasn't even written down. It was all meticulously memorized and passed down orally from teacher to student. Just imagine that. So, the Rig Veda is made up of over 1,000 hymns called suktas, which literally means well said. And these aren't really stories, they're more like powerful prayers aimed at key gods. You've got Agni, the god of fire, who kind of acted like a messenger to the heavens. Then there's Indra, the powerful warrior god. And Soma, which was this mysterious plant used to make a special ritual drink. Okay, this is where the detective work really kicks into high gear. Listen to this line from a sage talking to two rivers. "O rivers, come down, like two swift horses, like two shining cows." See, he isn't just describing water flowing, he's comparing it to horses and cows. Now you gotta ask yourself, why those specific animals? That simple little comparison is a massive clue. It tells historians that horses and cows weren't just farm animals. They were powerful symbols of speed and life itself. The mention of specific rivers helps pinpoint where these people lived. And that reference to a chariot, well, that reveals a key piece of their technology. It's all in there. But this brings up a fascinating puzzle. The hymns are just full of prayers for cattle and horses, right? It shows how much they were cherished. And yet, these same texts are also filled with talk of war and fighting. So what were they fighting over? Well, these battles weren't for some abstract idea like building an empire. Nope. They were fought for the most valuable resources you could get your hands on. For cattle, which was the main way to measure wealth. For land, to graze those cattle. For water, obviously. And sometimes to capture people. And this reveals a society that was organized really differently than we might think. You had priests, or Brahmins, who took care of the sacred rituals. And then you had leaders they called rajas. But these weren't kings like you're picturing. No grand palaces, no capital cities, no tax collectors. They were leaders, often warriors, chosen for their bravery, but without all the huge government stuff we see later in history. All right, so we've heard from the ancient voices. Now it's time for our second clue, the silent objects. We're shifting our investigation from the hymns to the graves, from what these people said to what they actually did. So a few centuries after the first hymns of the Rig Veda were being composed, a new practice started popping up in many parts of India, building megaliths. The word literally just means big stones, and that's exactly what they are. But these weren't just random piles of rocks. They were carefully arranged boulders, sometimes in circles, acting like silent sentinels watching over burial sites. I mean, just stop and think about the incredible effort this took. Without any modern machinery, people had to find the right stones, haul these massive boulders, dig pits, and arrange them just so. This tells us that honoring their dead in this very specific, very monumental way was unbelievably important to their communities. So what did archaeologists find when they carefully excavated these sites? Well, right alongside the skeletons, they found a whole range of objects. We're talking distinctive pottery, this stuff called black and red ware, iron weapons like daggers and axes, beautiful ornaments made of gold and stone, and yeah, even the skeletons of horses. It was almost like a toolkit for the afterlife. Now this is where it gets really telling. As you can see here, not all burials were created equal. Not by a long shot. Look at this difference.
Some people were buried with just a few simple pots. But in another burial, at a site called Brahmagiri, archaeologists found one skeleton buried with 33 gold beads, a bunch of stone beads, and several weapons. This huge difference is a major clue. It suggests that a social hierarchy was really starting to form. Some people were clearly wealthier or had a much higher status than others. Archaeologists also found that some of these megaliths had more than one skeleton inside. This hints that they weren't just for one person, but were more like family tombs, used again and again. Family members who died later were brought to the same spot, sometimes through these little entrances called portholes, so they could be buried with their relatives. Okay, so we have the story we're getting from the book, and we have the story from the burials. But the real magic, the real aha moment, is when historians lay these two sets of clues side by side and see how they line up. Let's see how these clues click together. Remember how the Rig Veda is just filled with prayers for horses, praising their speed and strength? Well, centuries later, what do archaeologists dig up in these megalithic burials? Bingo! The skeletons of horses buried with honor right next to humans. The ancient voice from the book and the silent object from the grave are telling us the exact same story. And what about those Rajas from the Rig Veda? You know, the leaders who didn't have palaces? Well, at a site called Enamgaon, archaeologists found this really remarkable burial. A man was buried in a giant clay jar, right in the courtyard of a 5-room house, which happened to be the biggest house at the whole site. This special burial of a potential chief fits the description of a Raja from the hymns perfectly. So, after examining all the evidence from both the ancient voices and the silent stones, what have we learned? What's the final verdict from our little investigation into the past? I think the biggest takeaway is this. History isn't just a static list of boring facts. It is an active, ongoing investigation. It's by piecing together these different clues, a line from a 3,500-year-old hymn about a horse, and then the actual skeleton of that horse in a tomb, that we can actually give a voice to these worlds that vanished long, long ago. And that leaves us with one final, pretty fascinating question to think about. Just imagine a historian 3,000 years from now trying to understand our world. If the only clues they had left were the books on our shelves and the things we are buried with, what kind of story would they tell about us?